Welcome back, everyone. We are continuing our breaking news coverage. President Trump announcing tonight that Iran's key nuclear facilities were, quote, totally obliterated by the U.S. Air Force. A Saudi nuclear regulator says no radioactive traces have been detected in the kingdom or Arab Gulf states as a result of U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer just sent out this statement saying, quote, President Trump must provide the American people and Congress clear answers on the actions taken tonight and their implications for the safety of Americans. No president should be allowed to unilaterally march this nation into something as consequential as war with erratic threats and no strategy. We must enforce the War Powers Act, and I'm urging Leader Thune to put it on the Senate floor immediately. I'm voting for it and implore all senators on both sides of the aisle to vote for it. With me now is Congressman Adam Smith, a Democrat from Washington and the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee. Congressman, it's great to see you again. Let me just ask you, did you have any indication, any insight as to whether or not this was happening tonight when the president was returning to the White House for this national security meeting?
Not directly. They didn't say that. But certainly from what President Trump has said, the repositioning of the B-2 bombers and other forces, and just his general vibe the last several days, it was not surprising. But no, there was no heads up that I'm aware of given to any congressional leaders.
I read your statement that you posted, which I think there are a lot of very important parts to it, and I wanted to kind of just go, through it with you a little bit. One of the points that you made, which I have not yet heard this evening from any American officials, and certainly as I read some statements from American officials, members of Congress questioning the legality of this strike. You went a step further. You said the president failed to provide clear objectives for these actions, and there are no guarantees that it will eliminate the possibility of Iran developing a nuclear weapon or how long it might set their program back. Elaborate on that and why you thought that was important to include tonight.
Sure. Several pieces to this. I mean, first of all, obviously, there are other issues with Iran than just their nuclear program. They are sponsoring a variety of different terrorist groups throughout the region, destabilizing governments. They have a ballistic missile program that is a threat. But on the nuclear program, the only thing that stopped the Iranian nuclear program was the JCPOA that President Obama negotiated. Everyone agrees that Iran was abiding by that, and they had stopped enriching uranium, and they had stopped moving towards developing a bomb. And then, of course, President Trump tore up the agreement, and Iran went back to enriching uranium and moving towards the bomb. Now, the military estimations, can you stop this? Can you drop a bunch of bombs and blow up all the centrifuges that we know about? We don't know that. Now, President Trump, in his typical fashion, claims facts not in evidence, saying we totally obliterated their whole program. Nobody knows that right now. Maybe, maybe not. We do not know how many of these centrifuges were destroyed. So that's number one. Number two, we can't be 100% sure that we knew about all of Iran's centrifuges. We didn't know about Fordo for about a decade before we discovered it. And number three, no one has talked about, well, how quickly could Iran reconstitute all of this? It sadly does not take that long to build centrifuges once you know how. So it's not necessarily the death blow to Iran's nuclear program. We're still going to have to negotiate with them at some point. So, this assumption that their nuclear program is gone and they'll never be able to build it is simply wrong at this point.
You used the word condemn in the strongest terms the president's decision. Again, I think very powerful words tonight. And you also said that the path the president has chosen risks unleashing a wider war in the region that is both incredibly unpredictable and treacherous, and that threatens the safety and the security of the United States, Israel, and ultimately the world. I get a sense, sir, and please correct me if I'm wrong, based on that language, you're extremely disappointed with what the president has done tonight.
Well, disappointed would be the wrong word because disappointed implies expectations. But I think it was wrong. I think it was a mistake. And the point is, we have forces throughout the region, in Qatar, in Bahrain, in Iraq, in the UAE. I was just there, as it happens, 2 months ago, in all of those countries and visited our forces. And they are all very vulnerable to Iranian attack. Now, we'll see. I mean, the future is notoriously hard to predict. Who knows for sure what Iran is going to do? But I'd sure be surprised if Iran simply capitulated at this point. And if they attack, all of those forces are at jeopardy. Now, we have force protection methods in place. they're not perfect. They're not necessarily going to protect all of our forces. And if Iran does that, then what does the president do in response? Does he just let that go? That seems unlikely. Look, this is the same thing back in Iraq. Saddam Hussein was a terrible guy. We didn't know whether or not Saddam Hussein was working towards a nuclear weapon back then because he wasn't being transparent about it. And you can imagine a world, well, gosh, if we just remove this guy, how much better would things be? Sure, but you don't know what comes next. And that's the lesson we learned. President Trump has not said anything yet about whether or not regime change is part of his objective. If it is, that's incredibly problematic. If it isn't, he should state clearly that it isn't. The best we can hope for now is that Iran does feel, backed into a corner is the wrong word. Iran decides to capitulate. And they come out and they negotiate in good faith, and we get to a peaceful resolution. But that is a huge roll of the dice. And then, of course, there is the constitutional issue that the president had no authority to start a war with Iran, which, make no mistake about it, that's what he did. Where that war goes, hard to say, but he started a war with Iran tonight.
And what do you think is Israel's responsibility in getting the U.S. into this moment? I mean, the president is certainly, by some assessment, and again, you used very strong language against the president of the United States. What responsibility does Israel have for starting this war 9 days ago, knowing ultimately that America was always going to come to Israel's defense at some point and perhaps even get involved in this war on behalf of Israel? I mean, it's safe to say the United States would not have been doing this tonight if Israel had not started this unprovoked war 9 days ago. And joining me now is NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel in Tel Aviv. It's still in the early hours of the morning there. Obviously, the big question today on everyone's mind, the president's calling it a spectacular success. The immediate question on everyone's mind is, A, how severe is the damage? Will it set Iran's nuclear program definitively back? And B, where does Iran go from here? If you can shed light on what Israel is bracing itself for today.
So the Israelis, on a very short-term basis, are concerned about a reprisal. The Home Front Command, which issues guidance and doesn't change its guidance that often, it has been giving a guidance here to remain vigilant up until now, has upped its level of alert, telling people that they should not attend any public gatherings, no sporting events, no school, no work gatherings, only essential work. So they are on a heightened state of alert, a semi-lockdown, if you will. They had already been, under attack with Iranian ballistic missiles coming down at Israel every single day for the last week or so. So this country was already on high alert. They're bracing for some sort of response. But the Israeli reaction, official reaction, has been absolutely to welcome this. You have Prime Minister Netanyahu echoing President Trump's statements. They are clearly working hand in glove. This is something that Israel has long wanted. On the street, right now the streets are quite quiet, but on the street when we talk to people, they are generally supportive of this military operation. It was seen as a better now than later philosophy that they were going to engage with Iran at some stage, that it was better to do it now before having a nuclear weapon. That's the view as it was seen from here. But there are countries in the region who might not be vocally expressing their concerns, who I'm hearing from privately, who are very worried that Israel and the United States now seem to have a feeling of unchecked power and that they don't know where this is going, that this was Prime Minister Netanyahu's goal, that he found President Trump relatively easily manipulated, and that he was going to do this and finally got the United States on board.
And of course, the window now opens itself to a possible Iranian retaliation. If you hear what the president said today, or see what he said today in the social media post, he suggested that any Iranian retaliation would be met with a greater force. Some see this right now as an opening, that if Iran does retaliate against America, certainly in the region, it would open the door for even more American involvement, potentially leading ultimately to regime change, something that the Israeli prime minister has agitated for, has certainly called for in the past. One senior official I've spoken to from the region said this could be the beginning of the end for the Islamic regime in Iran, depending on what they do next. Where do you see this going from a kind of big picture approach, not just in the short term? I mean, Iran is now cornered. If they do retaliate, they run the risk of going into a direct war with the United States, which wouldn't be very long for them. They wouldn't last very long. Or if they do nothing, they appear very weakened in the eyes of their own people and ultimately susceptible to its collapse.
No doubt, Iran has been put into a corner. They were engaged in negotiations. President Trump is framing this as we're using force in order to convince the Iranians to come back to the negotiating table, to think again. They thought they could keep their nuclear enrichment program. Well, now they don't have a nuclear enrichment program, so they better come back to the table now. But the Iranians believe that the negotiating table was all a trick, that they were lured into this process under false pretenses, that Netanyahu and Trump were always going to do this, that President Trump just recently said that they have 2 more weeks to negotiate, and barely a day went by before the bombs started dropping on those nuclear sites today. So Iran, there's no trust. There never had been trust, but Iran feels, and I was just in Iran, and officials there have been saying this publicly, that they believe that this process was only designed to get them to put their guard down and allow them to be attacked. Now, can they go back to negotiations? The ones they believe are fictitious and set up to make them fail? What choice do they have? Because if they engage directly with the U.S. military, even more so, then they could face a total annihilation of their military capacity, including their capacity to maintain control over law and order at home. There have been some attacks on Iranian police.
Trump made a big mistake here because this is going to lead to escalation. Whether, at the very least, economic escalation, right? Because Iran has already said now that they're going to close the Strait of Hormuz, where a lot of oil comes out, right? Like, not just from Iran. Iran is an oil exporting nation, but other countries like Kuwait and Iraq, like a lot of the oil comes out of that Gulf right there, right? And so Iran, if they are going to indeed close it off, that could lead to further conflicts. Is the U.S. going to start bombing Iranian ships now? Is there going to be troops not on the ground, but will U.S. military vessels be fighting with men on them and women on them in an open conflict to keep the oil flowing? God knows what. But even if it just leads to a trade war, the cost of oil is going to go up. Like, your gas is going to get more expensive. And I know it's like people are like countries are getting bombed and we're talking about like gas prices, but voters are going to care if their gas prices go up because of this. So Donald, at the very least, has created a potential economic quagmire for himself, because voters, even if they're like, oh, like even if some MAGAs love him bombing countries, if their gas goes up again, like it did during the early Biden period, and he lost support because of higher gas prices, Trump will too. Mark my words. And so will the GOP in the midterms. But beyond all that, it's like, this puts everybody at risk. Trump's irrational action, which was denied by his own people days ago. Tulsi Gabbard, before she got told to shut up, but she told the truth originally, she was like, we have no evidence. Jon Stewart did a great segment. Since 1996, Iran has been weeks away from a weapon. And all for his ego and to change the script on his domestic failures? Trump has bombed a country for a reason that doesn't exist.